As you may have seen from the announcement, gentlemen, the Camper Run banners are about to arrive as well. Should you pull and build them? Perhaps, yes. The main recommendation here is Hare, as she is still seen quite often in raid battles. Kotama, however, is much rarer nowadays. She mainly shines against Hare, where she serves as one of the core CC options, especially for those who are tired of relying on Kyoko's basic skill and dealing with CC mold. The other two banners are completely skippable, but let's first talk about what they actually do. Starting with Hare. She is a striker supporter who applies an attack buff to one selected ally, with an incredibly cheap X skill cost of only 2. She works especially well when your special slots are already occupied by best-in-slot supports, like Misaki and Nagisa. If you still need an attack buffer, bringing Hare is no longer possible, because both special slots are already taken. That is where Hare comes in as a striker support replacement. Her buff duration is also noticeably longer than Hare's, and overall she performs extremely well across most raid content. Her basic skill periodically increases the attack of nearby allies. Her enhanced skill itself is not particularly useful since it only increases her own attack, which does very little for her role as a supporter. However, at UE40, it also increases her buff duration, allowing her buffs to comfortably last through around 3 consecutive DPS X skill bursts. Her sub-skill is also fairly insignificant, as increasing her own damage does not contribute much to her supporting role. She has appeared in numerous raid teams, and I highly recommend pulling and building her. That said, if you're planning to spark another student instead, let's say Sia, if you missed her previously, you may have to skip this banner and save your Pyrex instead. Alternatively, Hare is available through the selector ticket. If you're willing to purchase one, it is a much better way to obtain her while saving the Pyrex needed for a spark. If buying the selector ticket isn't an option, then skipping Hare is generally not recommended, unless you simply have no choice, especially if you don't have enough Pyrex to safely spark her. The second banner is Kotama. She is a striker supporter whose X skill applies a long duration stun to a single enemy. This CC is extremely valuable against Hare and Wakabode Phase 1. For Wakabode Phase 1 however, most players still choose Kyoko instead. Against Hare, Kotama becomes one of the core CC students for insane and higher difficulties. Her basic skill increases the attack of herself and nearby allies by a small amount. Honestly, the value is fairly low, so I'm not entirely sure how much impact it actually provides. Her enhanced skill also increases her own attack, which again is not particularly useful. However, at UE40, it significantly strengthens her CC power, and this is exactly what makes her so effective against bosses like Hare on Insane and above. Below those difficulties, the additional CC power has virtually no effect. Her sub-skill also provides very little value. The main reason you build Kotama is simply for her X skill CC, against Hare or Wakabode Phase 1 on higher difficulties. Next is Maki. She is a special explosive DPS. Her X skill deals damage while ignoring enemy shields. Unfortunately, that effect is not particularly useful in most raid content. Her basic skill increases her own explosive effectiveness against light armored enemies. Her enhanced skill increases her attack, and UE40 further boosts it. Her sub-skill increases the critical damage of all allies. Overall, she looks like a decent special explosive DPS for Gebura, but she simply isn't strong enough to replace established options like Satsuki or Karin. Building Maki without a specific purpose could easily become a poor investment. So overall, Maki is a skippable banner. She does deal respectable damage, but her biggest advantage is being able to destroy the ice pillars immediately, instead of waiting for them to collide. As for Misaki, skip. She has no meaningful use cases at the moment, so I'm not even going to explain what she does. So that covers these rerun banners. The only student I genuinely recommend pulling is Hare, as she is still commonly used across many raid teams. Kotama is optional, mainly if you want a dedicated CC solution for Hare, especially if you're tired of Kyoko's basic skill mold. She also works well for Wakabode Phase 1, although Kyoko remains the preferred option for most players. C Maki is mostly for those who fall in love with her cuteness rather than her actual utility. And Misaki. Still skip. Of course, you can also skip every banner here and save your spark for someone with greater value. If possible, buying a selector ticket for C Hare is the better option. Otherwise, cope harder and hope she spooks you as an off-rate someday. Build recommendations for C Hare. 3 stars is already sufficient. If you're willing to invest further, UE40 is recommended, for the additional buff duration. Max her X skill, basic skill, and level. If you raise her to UE40, then also max her enhanced skill, since that's what improves her buff duration. For her gear, only the second and third slots need to be fully upgraded. Her first slot is a hat, which provides very little benefit for her supporting role. For C Kotama, maximize her level. At 3 stars, simply max her X skill. If you decide to raise her to UE40, then max her enhanced skill as well to maximize her CC power. For Insane Hod, 3 stars with a maxed X skill is generally enough. For gear, maximize only the second and third slots. You can even leave the third slot at tier 9, since tier 10 provides now additional CC related benefits. Her first slot is gloves, which also provide very little value for her CC ability. While pulling on C Hare's banner, you may want to use your spark on C Kotama as a CC applier for Hod or Wackaboat phase 1. Or perhaps you'd rather spend that spark on someone you find cuter, like Rina or C Maki. With all that said, make sure you're prepared for the next banners, as the limited rerun banners for C and C Asuna should be arriving soon after this one. On top of that, you'll also need to save enough Pyrex for the upcoming Fox Squad banners, as those are highly recommended as well. And that should be all. As always, Godspeed.